Welcome to this panel on the future of the JCPOA. I had the privilege of speaking earlier in the program today to briefly reintroduce myself in this regard. I'm Joe Lieberman, and I'm honored to be the chair of United Against Nuclear Iran, UANI. We have a really great panel today of three experts to discuss in the full range of our difficult relations with Iran and our allies and enemies about Iran. This is really, for now, the main event, the JCPOA, and whether it's possible to renew it, as President Biden and the European leaders want to do, in a way that protects our security and that of our allies. Let me introduce the panel. And first we start with Michael SINGH. Michael is the managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a former senior director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. He's also served as a special assistant to Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, and we're very pleased to say that Michael is on the advisory board of UANI. He has written an important piece, I think, recently in Foreign Affairs, outlining the need for Washington to develop and implement a Plan B on Iran, which we will get to during our discussion. ILAN Goldenberg is the director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, on whose board I am honored to serve. Prior to CNAS, Mr. Goldenberg served as chief of staff to the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the Department of State, and as a special advisor on the Middle East, and then as the Iran team chief in the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under President Obama. SIMA Shine is currently the head of the Iran program at the Institute for National Security Studies, which is one of Israel's leading think tanks. Ms. Shine spent most of her career in the Israeli intelligence community, including as head of research and evaluation at the Mossad, and then as deputy head of strategic affairs on Israel's National Security Council, and as Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, where she was responsible for the Iranian files. So you can hear in that detail that we've got people who have really been deeply involved in the Iran issue and really have a lot to bring to this panel. And I appreciate very much that they're part of it. UANI has a record here. UANI was formed, as I said earlier in the day, by Mark Wallace, Dennis Ross, Richard Holbrooke, a bipartisan organization which had the goal of preventing the Islamic Republic of Iran from becoming the regional power in the Middle East, the hegemon, and particularly, as our title says, to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. As such, we supported sanctions in Congress successfully. We weren't alone, of course, but they did pass and had an effect on Iran. We also have done a lot of work in the private sector, encouraging, shall we say, or threatening private entities to comply with the sanctions laws adopted by Congress and signed by presidents of both parties to essentially stop doing business with Iran. We also strongly opposed the JCPOA when it was negotiated by the P5+1 and Iran, and opposed it in Congress in the attempt to stop it, which failed and went into effect in 2015. So we have a record here, and I would say we're skeptical. We're never against negotiations, with Iran, but we're skeptical about whether a good agreement with Iran is possible. But having said that, there will be, I assume, a range of opinions among our panelists today, and UANI welcomes that. As there's too little of that in our political discourse in America today, which is to say, reasoned civil discussion of important and complicated issues. So let's begin with just a quick opening question for the three of you. We're talking about the future of JCPOA, but let us know how you felt about JCPOA when it was negotiated and implemented in 2015. Were you positive or negative about it? Michael, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel, to be with UANI and to be alongside ILAN and SIMA. Look, in 2015, when we had, I would say, a very robust debate about the JCPOA, I had serious concerns about it. And it's not that I'm opposed to a diplomatic agreement with Iran or think that one isn't possible to achieve. My concerns were more about the specifics of the JCPOA, because what we have seen from Iran is that it is willing and it has been able in the past to use its agreements and its cooperation with the international community, with the International Atomic Energy Agency, with other entities, to try to strategically advance its nuclear program while trying to also avoid consequences for doing so. And my worry about the JCPOA was that while it froze or even rolled back some elements of Iran's nuclear program in a positive way, that it also created space for Iran to make nuclear advancements in key areas where it was lagging behind. So, for example, the JCPOA would allow Iran to continue its research on advanced centrifuges. Advanced centrifuges are important for Iran if it wants to eventually make a nuclear weapon, because they would allow Iran to do that, to enrich uranium, at least in theory, in smaller facilities which might be easier to hide from the view of the IEA or Western intelligence agencies. It allowed Iran to continue its missile work. And again, missiles are a key component, obviously, of a deliverable nuclear weapon. And one of those areas in which maybe Iran still had some work to do as of 2015, when it came to developing a long-range missile capable of delivering a nuclear weapon. The JCPOA was essentially silent on the missile aspect of a nuclear weapons program. And then finally, what we didn't see from the JCPOA was any real requirement that Iran come clean on its past nuclear activities. And this is less about sort of somehow punishing Iran for those past activities. We have punished Iran through sanctions and other means for those activities, and more about accounting for the different entities involved and individuals and locations involved in that nuclear weapons program, that nuclear weapons work that we knew went on and has been further illuminated since through the Israeli seized nuclear archive, which David Albright wrote about very clearly in a book that he put out recently. We know that was even fuller, even larger than we knew about. So my concern was essentially that there were these gaps in the nuclear restrictions imposed by the JCPOA, and that those gaps would allow Iran to make progress towards a nuclear weapon. There were other sort of shortcomings, I thought, in the JCPOA, but that was the key thing. It simply didn't have sufficient restrictions in place on Iran's nuclear program.
Okay, that's a good beginning. ILAN, I assume you have a different point of view, at least in part, from the one Michael has just expressed.
Yeah, thank you, Senator, and great to be here with UANI and with Mike and SIMA. Yeah, look, I mean, I ultimately supported the JCPOA in 2015 and continue to think that, every diplomatic agreement and every tough negotiation, as you know, Senator, when you were in the Senate, you never get everything that you want in these agreements,
Correct.
Right? And so when I look at the pluses and minuses, for me, the most important thing was the inspections regime, because I tend to agree that, the way Iran gets to a nuclear weapon most likely is through a secret program of some sort where they take all the technology and knowledge that they have accumulated and use it to basically start another facility elsewhere. And the inspections regime that involved, that by the way lasted in many cases in perpetuity, in other cases 25 years, was one of the best, maybe the best we've ever had anywhere, right? With the sort of 24-hour constant video surveillance, the ability, everything from the very monitoring from the very beginning of the project, from taking ore out of the ground all the way to building centrifuges to any production. And so I thought those were the strongest pieces of it. And that's one of the things that made the agreement the most meaningful to me, in addition to significantly rolling back sort of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. And I know I agree with Mike that obviously it would have been nice to get more on missiles. I think that was just not possible given where the Russians and the Chinese were. I tend to disagree on the next generation centrifuges, only because I do think those are one of the biggest concerns, but I actually thought that under the JCPOA, most of that work, the meaningful work, had to wait years and we had eyes into it. Whereas we've seen what happens when we've withdrawn now and Iran has started this work much more quickly than I think it would have under the JCPOA. And yeah, on the history, yes, I think it would have been good to see the history and of past work. But I think the argument against that was, again, was it realistic to get in an agreement, and did we care about other things more? And also, did we have enough confidence in our intelligence already, and in the abilities of countries like Israel to go steal large pieces of, steal is the wrong word, to get large pieces of this intelligence out of Iran and share it with the world, that we really need them to come clean on everything, or could we do it without it? So look, I think these are all, it matters less at this point because these debates, are just the debates of the past. But yeah, I think we agree on some of the strengths and weaknesses of the agreement. We just come down on different conclusions of whether we should have done it or not based on that.
Okay, that's excellent. SIMA, as we all remember, there were consequences beyond the direct content and implementation of JCPOA. And one was that it created quite a significant rupture, you might say, between the US and our very close allies in Israel, because of the different points of view on the JCPOA, including, of course, significantly, the speech that then Prime Minister Netanyahu gave to a joint session of Congress opposing the JCPOA. But it also, in domestic politics, and maybe we'll have time to come back to this, created a real division between the parties on Iran policy, which generally has not existed. Generally, there's been bipartisan support. But you, based on your background in the intelligence community, in a way, acknowledging that those political diplomatic consequences in our bilateral relationship occurred, I think can speak to us about your reaction to the JCPOA, I suppose primarily in terms of how it would affect Israel, and as we know, quite similarly, how it would affect our American allies in the Arab world.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to UANI. I want to actually, you have mentioned a very important event, and that's the relations between the government of Israel and the Obama administration. As you all know, there were debates within Israel as well, within the intelligence community as well. Let me put one emphasis on something that was not mentioned enough by both of my colleagues, and that is at the end of the day, an agreement that both sides want to reach is the best way, if it works, to stop a program like that. The problem is that Iran didn't come to those negotiations in order to stop its program. It came in order to make sure that it can enable this program to continue in the future. So they were willing to take a pause for a certain time on some aspects, not on all of aspects, in order to be able to continue later in a better, from a better position. What is important, and I think from the Israeli point of view, the most problematic clause in the agreement was the legitimacy that it gave to Iran for enrichment when the sunset comes and when the agreement expires. That was something that Iran was very important for Iran to get the legitimacy to continue enrichment in any scale they want, in any with any kind of centrifuge that they will be able to advance. Both of my colleagues have mentioned the advanced centrifuge. That was the main clause that was contrary to the spirit of the agreement. That was, the spirit was to roll back the program. The advanced centrifuge were promoting the program. So I think from Israel's point of view, even those like me who supported the agreement as fait accompli, because that's what the Obama administration wanted to get. Even for me, it was difficult to overcome the question of the legitimacy after 10 to 15 years, and the issue of the advanced centrifuge that will bring, because Iran is already doing it, will bring Iran within a short time to a situation where, as was mentioned before, they can enrich in a smaller place to a higher quality and quantity of enriched uranium. So that was a huge problem from the point of view of Israel, but that was in the past. I want to say that if that agreement would exist today, the question from the very first day was how Israel and the US use the period that this agreement gave in order to, one, improve our position once Iran decides to leave or to do something, and two, how we make, if it's possible, Iran change its position and be willing to extend the timeline of the agreement. Of course, this is not anymore the issue, and the issue that you probably will raise later is how can we proceed from this point that we are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I assume you would say that at least in the period during which, in the period before President Trump withdrew the US from the JCPOA, that the changes that you, or generally the Israeli government, had hoped that might happen as a result of the JCPOA in Iran did not happen. Is that fair to say?
That's true to say. I would say not that we believe that it, in high percentage, that it will happen, but right. there was a feeling that if both sides will be able to conduct economic relations and other things might change in Iran. But I personally have to say that we didn't plan our strategy on these hopes. There was, right. It could be a side effect. We didn't plan on that, and we really believe that one should be prepared to the day after.
Yeah, so as you speak, I remember once in a conversation, excuse me, with someone in the Israeli defense intelligence community. This was before the JCPOA. He said to me that the development of nuclear weapons was so important to the regime in Tehran that the only way they would willingly, not happily, end their nuclear program would be if they felt that the survival of their regime was in doubt if they didn't. And it was a stark statement, but I must say, since then, I haven't seen anything to say that that wasn't accurate. And of course, it makes the whole challenge of negotiating with them for something more than a pause in their nuclear program, assuming they would keep their word about it, very difficult. So let me ask, I can start with you, Sim, and then work backward this time, although in the way you answered it, as we're discussing this now, as it appears that the negotiations of the P5+1 with Iran may begin again about the JCPOA. So what lessons do you think we should have, all of us, learned from at least the time during which the agreement was in effect before President Trump withdrew the US from it? So I'll ask the three of you. In other words, if President Biden or Secretary Blinken ask each of you, what should we be thinking as we go back to the table with Iran? What would you say? Sima, you can start.
Okay. I think it's difficult to draw conclusions from that period because I think something very dramatic has happened. 2021 and is not 2015. Iran, actually, I think this is the main problem today. Iran is much more extreme on most of its policies, the regional one, the missiles, also on the nuclear one. The leader that was never supporting the agreement and just at the end gave his approval, but never trusted the Americans and was for a long period was against any compromises, is just today much more assured that his policy, he was correct in the way he was looking on the American administration. And I think he's already now looking to the period of the 8 years of the current president. After these 8 years, he is looking for the legacy that he will leave one day. And I think this legacy does not include agreement with the US, good relations with the US. On the contrary, from his point of view, the way to preserve the system is by confronting the US and by gathering stronger the people around the values, so-called the values of the Islamic Republic that he is portraying as a contrary to the spoiled and the immoral values of the West, especially the US. So I think it would be very difficult to draw conclusions from that time and try and use them today. And I think today, I personally tend to believe that there is no real willing in Tehran to go back to the JCPOA. They today, 6 years later, I think they don't see the same benefits that they can have from the agreement. And actually, they are trying, I don't know if they will succeed, but they are trying to build I would say, alternative possibilities for Iran to continue its economic survival, because good situation will not be there, but the economic survival with Russia and China, and surf and be able to continue with the project to a point in time that everyone will talk differently to Iran. That's the way they believe it will happen once they are a threshold country.
So that's a very helpful answer, very interesting. While you were talking, I was remembering something I read a long time ago, a historian of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And he wrote that, used a familiar old metaphor, that the US and Soviet Union were like the scorpion and the tarantula in a bottle. Each assumes that the other wants to kill it and therefore kills first or strikes first. And, you know, there's no question that I see Iran as an extremely hostile to the US and threatening not only our values, but our security interests, and therefore not trustworthy. Obviously, as your answer implies, to a certain extent, they see us the same way. And it's it creates a challenge. So, okay, having said that, Ilan, I'm interested in how you would advise President Biden and Secretary Blinken if the negotiations, in fact, do begin again.
Yeah, well, so I tend to agree we're in a very tough spot. Can folks hear me, by the way? I frozen up there for a second. But yeah, I tend to agree we're in a tough spot. I think part of the problem now is really that both sides say they want to go back into the deal. I mean, the Iranians continue to say they want to go back into the JCPOA, but I'm not sure that they might, but I think they have a particular vision of what that agreement looks like.
Okay, we lost you for a moment. Control tower, can you bring Ilan back in? Okay, let's go to Michael.
Actually,
and we'll try to come back to
Senator,
Ilan as soon as we have him back with us.
I'm back. If
welcome back.
I think we had a tech issue there for a moment. So I don't know if you heard any, but basically I'll just start again and hopefully
good.
To say that I think we are in a tough spot right now. Partially, look, the Iranians keep saying they want to go back into the JCPOA, and I think they might, but only on terms that are okay for them, which means, you know, the types of things that they're asking for now in terms of, a number of different things, or really some kind of proof. They want the U.S. to go first. They want proof that we're not going to walk away again. You know, as bad as trust was before, trust is much worse now after the U.S. has walked away from the agreements. All the reasons SIMA described for the hardening of the leadership. I think a big part of that hardening is the experience of the last few years, where there wasn't any trust in the first place, but a unilateral American withdrawal has only made things worse. So I would actually say, in terms of lessons learned from history, I actually think the strongest lesson might be, actually not necessarily from the period when we were implementing the agreement, but actually 2009 to 2012 when I worked on this issue. And I think this is a little bit similar to what Mike was arguing in his Foreign Affairs article, which is, leave diplomacy on the table, which we did early in the Obama administration. We put a diplomatic offer on the table, the Tehran Research Reactor Agreement, if folks remember. The Iranians turned it down because of internal wrangling inside the country. We left it on the table, and we started building alternative options while not taking it off the table. And part of leaving it on the table was building diplomatic support internationally from the other members, continuing to demonstrate it's the U.S. that's acting in good faith. Leaving the possibility of diplomacy there if the Iranians change their mind, while at the same time looking at what else you could build. And ultimately, we ended up with UN Security Council Resolution 1929. So this is the advice I would give to President Biden and Secretary Blinken today. Keep the JCPOA negotiations on the table, keep Vienna on the table, be willing to engage seriously with the Iranians as we have over the past few months before they walked away. But also recognize that, this might not work, that there's actually an increasingly lower probability that the Iranians will be willing to go back to the JCPOA on terms acceptable to the United States and its partners. And so start building your alternatives, whether that's, more sanctions, whether that's, possibilities of military pressure, whatever those alternatives are to strengthen your hand, and see if that either brings them to the table in terms that are better for us, or we have an alternative option ready if we need to. The only thing I'll say is, I think our options are a lot worse than they were a few years ago, because we've already used so many of the sanctions. We need China to be a partner in this and not buying Iranian oil, and they're in a very different place with the United States than they were years ago. And the Iranians also didn't get as much sanctions relief out of the JCPOA as they thought they would. So the benefits for them on the other side also seem a little different. I've heard one colleague describe it as, our sticks are not as sharp and our carrots aren't as tasty as they were a few years ago. And that makes this whole situation much more difficult.
Yeah, well said. Michael, you were a skeptic, at least, about the original JCPOA JCPOA, what would you advise President Biden, Secretary Blinken about what they should have learned from the experience with the JCPOA if, in fact, they get back to negotiations?
Well, so even though I was maybe more critical of the JCPOA, I think maybe I'm actually more optimistic than Ilan about the situation going forward.
Really?
Look, I think that we did learn some lessons from that early period of implementation of the JCPOA. There was this idea that the JCPOA, in part because we were dealing with what we saw as a more pragmatic administration in Iran, would somehow unlock better relations or more agreements or some kind of continued diplomatic progress between the United States and Iran. That did not happen even in the remaining time that President Obama was in office. And I think that is a lesson for this period going forward. And I think it's a lesson actually that both Republicans and Democrats have absorbed in the United States. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you hear not just Republicans talking about the need for a stronger agreement. That obviously was President Trump's sort of policy objective, at least the one that was articulated. It's also the policy objective of President Biden. He talks about going back to the JCPOA as a stepping stone to a stronger agreement. So you have this interesting dynamic now in Washington where, for all of our differences on this issue, actually all parties agree that we need a stronger nuclear agreement, that should be our policy objective. And that's good that we have at least that level of agreement. I think Ilan is right that the Iranians drew lessons from that period as well. And the main lesson I think they drew was that sanctions relief was not all that it was cracked up to be, that they didn't get what they were expecting. Maybe their expectations were unrealistic, but also, frankly, private businesses, the private sector, was reluctant to re-engage with Iran, despite the U.S. saying it's okay to do so, because there are a lot of other problems involved in dealing with Iran from a commercial standpoint. And there's always the prospect of additional sanctions, especially because you didn't have that bipartisan support for the JCPOA in 2015. And so I think a lot of private sector entities correctly anticipated what then did in fact happen, was you had a Republican administration come into office and leave the deal. I think, though, that we have to remember that when we have had success diplomatically, when we've had policy success against Iran, it has been when we have brought to bear all of our policy tools in concert, and when we have been acting together with our partners in Europe, as well as our regional partners. And I do think, again, that that's a lesson that hopefully the Biden administration has absorbed. So, the Trump administration brought tremendous economic pressure to bear on Iran and had a tremendous impact on the Iranian economy, but I would say didn't manage to diplomatically isolate Iran by withdrawing unilaterally from the JCPOA. In a sense, that put Iran much more on the side of those other parties of the P5+1 who wanted to revive the deal. And in the past, you could argue we also have maybe forsaken this tool or that tool. We weren't applying strong enough economic pressure. Maybe we didn't have a credible military deterrent in place. I do think that if the Biden administration can really sort of threaten Iran with real consequences for not engaging in the discussion that the Biden administration wants on a stronger nuclear agreement, and those consequences would not just be economic sanctions, but in this case, diplomatic isolation, because we have gotten back on board, I would say, back on the same page, at least to a significant extent, with, say, our European and other allies. And also there's an effort, I think, at least hopefully a sincere effort to coordinate with our regional partners as well. If they can make that message clear and make clear that, in fact, despite all the talk of a pivot to Asia, talk which is justified from a sort of big strategic point of view, that we are still willing to consider the use of military force to stop Iran ultimately from getting a nuclear weapon if those other means fail, then I think if we bring all those things to bear, it does put Iran in a difficult position and maybe does create circumstances where we could get a stronger nuclear agreement. Now, my advice has been from the start that we're actually better off going straight to that discussion of a stronger agreement, because my worry is that by going back to the JCPOA, if Iran were to agree to that, that will then become a difficult position to move on from, because we will have already given Iran significant sanctions relief. We'll have relieved a lot of that pressure prematurely, I think, in a sense, before getting what ultimately President Biden wants to get. And then that will prove to be a difficult task. I think, though, that part of this, Senator Lieberman, is you do have to have the bipartisan support. And I would argue, and I argued in my foreign affairs piece, that that would actually also make the agreement more appealing to Iran. It would help satisfy one of Iran's concerns, which is that you'll have another Republican administration come around and withdraw from the deal. To me, the answer to that problem is not that, well, we should try to build in some intricate mechanism that gets us around our domestic political problem. It's that we need to address our domestic political problem as part of our policy. Now, that's tough to do. I'll acknowledge that, but I think that that's a necessary step.
That's a great last point. The whole statement was, I think, valuable and interesting. But let me enter and make an editorial comment. I spend a lot of time worrying about and working to try to restore some bipartisan common ground to American politics, particularly in Congress. And I must say that I smiled, if not audibly laughed, at the Iranian demand, you might say, that they don't want to enter another agreement that the next administration of another party breaks or withdraws from, as President Trump did. And there is the one answer to that is a bipartisan consensus on the next agreement, if there is one, with Iran. Now, that's easier said than done, but I would say just briefly that in certainly the modern history of arms control negotiations and agreements, they've all pretty much had bipartisan support. And part of that is that presidents have submitted them to the Senate as treaties. So they required 2/3 vote. That meant that they required a lot of work. And I understand completely why President Obama chose to submit the JCPOA as an executive agreement, if you will. And therefore, we who opposed it needed 2/3 effectively to override a veto if we could get enough votes to take it up. We got somewhere in the mid-50s, but not 60 to break a filibuster. This is a long statement to say that it will be harder. And incidentally, from Iran's point of view, the U.S. would probably be more demanding in a negotiated agreement with the intention of getting some bipartisan support. It doesn't need every member of both parties, but it would have the high probability, which has certainly been the case in arms control agreements generally, not totally, with, for instance, the former Soviet Union or Russia. So I hope that is a lesson learned, particularly with the new support from the Islamic Republic of Iran for the no labels position of bipartisanship in our domestic and foreign policy. Okay, that was a very interesting set of answers. One of the things that fascinates me, and I just wanted to ask you about this, because of some of the people who follow and are very interested in what's happening in Iran, opponents of the regime, and wondering about what may happen, really worried about what will come out of a next round of negotiations with Iran. One of the premises has been, which in different ways, three of you questioned, which is that right now Iran, the regime in Iran is weak. It's relatively at the weakest point since the revolution in '79. The economy is suffering in part because of sanctions. I'm saying this is part of the argument, interested in what you said. The government is clearly of Iran has been very incompetent in dealing with COVID-19. So I gather from sources that I talked to that there's a lot of unrest about that among the Iranian people. The repression by the government, arresting journalists, political opponents, executing people continues. Iran is still on number one on the State Department list of nation supporters of terrorism. Their regional aggression goes on. So, but the point, but then in the midst of all this, as I guess Sima said, maybe the two of you did, the two others did as well, the opinion of the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, seems to have gotten more difficult and more demanding. Maybe it's a tactic. I'm going to ask you that. So he selects, really, not elects, but selects, you see who is nominally or virtually, you might say, elected in an election in Iran in which fewer people voted than at any time since the revolution of 79. So I guess my question, and we've got about 10 minutes left, so maybe not too long an answer on this one, shorter than my framing of the question. What's going on in Iran? What's their state of mind about their position as they potentially come back to the negotiating table? Ilan, maybe you should start this time.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, look, my sense is I agree with what's already been said, especially Sima's point that the Supreme Leader was never a strong supporter of the nuclear agreement. He was partially tilted, but the Supreme Leader, look, he's the guy in charge, but he also listens to all the people around him. He sees all the different power bases. Iran's not like an absolute autocracy, like a Stalinist type state where there's one guy making all the decisions. There's a lot of different power centers. And the calculus in 2015 was very much everybody wanted a deal. Everybody was worried about where the economy was and sanctions, or close to everybody. So the Supreme Leader kind of went along pretty skeptical. Now you have, because the agreement in many ways has been discredited, you have many more forces. Those who are opposing are much stronger, right? And you have the Raisi and the team that's around him. Again, it's, Raisi matters not because he makes the decisions, but because now Khamenei hears from him a lot. Now we have a foreign minister and a deputy foreign minister who's a chief negotiator, especially, who's deeply skeptical of the agreement in the first place. So these are the voices that he's now hearing. So I think that makes a big difference and makes it harder. I also think on just the point of domestically, look, things are tough in Iran economically. Things are tough with COVID. Things have been tough in Iran for a very long time. Things that were definitely tougher in the 80s. We as the United States have a terrible track record of being able to know when these things lead to fundamental regime change or whether a government is going to last for another 50 years. So I think we've learned that, we can't make that the basis of our policy. And we have no idea what happens if the Iranian government falls. I mean, you could end up with a civil war that's worse than things you've seen in Syria. So I'm not sure we necessarily want that either. I mean, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but we have to sort of base our policy and what we want based on, we don't want them to get a nuclear weapon. We have problems with their behavior in the region. How do we try to affect that? And how do we try to change their calculus, the way Mike was describing, or others, and the way we have historically, rather than this idea that we can somehow overturn them. I think that is just, that might happen one day, but not because of us. And it's a fool's errand to try to make that the basis of our policy.
Okay, thank you. That was great. Sima, do you want to add to that about, you touched on this earlier, but what from your perspective is going on within the minds of the key decision makers in Tehran?
I think and that's very important also to other issues, that there is a feeling in Tehran that they are winning. Not to put it in the framework of such a good situation, internal situation, but they feel that regionally they are winning. They have a lot of friends in different countries. They have a lot of problems as well, but still they have their foothold in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, of course, in Yemen. We see they understand that the Gulf countries are willing to talk to them because they don't feel that they will have any support from the US, so better relations with Iran. So I think the feeling in Iran is that they are in a better situation than they were before. This is one thing. The other one is that the decision was made much stronger than it was before. There was a debate between two camps in Tehran. Those that supported going to the West, like Rouhani and Zarif and people like him, and that thought that the way to preserve the system is by improving economic relations with the West and by having a better life to the people. The other camp was skeptical and was thinking that the best way to preserve the system is by going to the Chinese and the Russians and having a stronger hold on the population and not opening to the West. And I think what happened is that this camp has won the debate.
Yeah.
And those people are now the people that are sitting in the important positions in the decision making in Tehran. And it's not only that they need Russia and China for economic cooperation because of sanctions and others. It's also because they think that the system, the political system, they will not be criticized for less democracy and human rights by the Chinese and the Russians. So I think they feel much closer to this camp than to the Western camp. And of course, all the other things that were mentioned before, the distrust to the US and the disappointment from what happened. So if you combined all this together, there is today much more monolithic way of thinking in Tehran, which wasn't before. Not that everybody agrees on everything, but it is much more monolithic than it was before. And it's much more in the direction that the leader also supports and is in the same camp. And from that point of view, they do feel stronger than they were before.
Interesting. So I agree. I mean, even we always argued about the previous foreign minister, whether he really represented the government in his moderate face, and yet he was there. There's no one like that anymore in Raisi's government, which is really a statement. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask for a little latitude by the people controlling the Zoom if we go over a minute or two more. But there has been, it strikes me, an American policy toward Iran in these negotiations, what, to borrow a term from another part of the world, might be called strategic ambiguity. The optimistic rush by the Biden administration or desire to get back into the JCPOA has now been tempered somewhat. Just a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Blinken, Rob Malley making statements that we have to get ready for possibility of no agreement. And then surprised me by removing sanctions on this Mahmoud Industrial Group and its executives who were supplying the Iranian missile program. And then this week, imposing new sanctions on the IRGC and the people involved there who we are charging with operating this drone program that has attacked Americans in the region and international shipping. Okay, talk about strategic ambiguity, and I understand it. It leaves latitude before negotiations occur. Last weekend, there was a significant statement signed alongside the G20 by President Biden with the E3, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. And I'll just read two parts quickly. We expressed our determination to ensure that Iran can never develop or acquire a nuclear weapon, and shared our grave and growing concern that while Iran halted negotiations on a return to the JCPOA since June, it has accelerated the pace of provocative nuclear steps, such as the production of highly enriched uranium and enriched uranium metal. And then a few paragraphs later says, we are convinced that it is possible to quickly reach and implement an understanding on return to full compliance and to ensure for the long term that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively for peaceful purposes. So, as I say, I understand strategic ambiguity as you go into negotiations, but from this and Biden policy in the recent weeks and months, hard to know exactly where they're heading. So my final question is this, and Michael certainly touched on it based on his recent article. What is the plan B? Let's say the negotiations never start again, or they start and they fail. So what then, assuming that the US and our allies in Israel and the Arab world certainly, and hopefully in Europe, feel like we need to do something to stop Iran's nuclear program. Ilan, maybe you should start. You talked a little about it, but not a lot before.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, look, I think that plan B is to build up all the alternatives to a negotiation while leaving the negotiation on the table, which I think is what you see the Biden administration doing. Mike talked about the importance of international unity. Like, we don't have a lot of economic sanctions left that could damage the economy, but international unity and opposition is, I think, a part of this. And that statement from the G20, I would argue, is part of Plan B, right? Which is building as much international unity, or I guess, to demonstrate to the Iranians that they are isolated, doing the economic pressure while leaving negotiations on the table, is where we're going to go. But what I don't think you're going to do is people keep looking for that moment where the Biden administration comes out and says, now we are doing Plan B. Like, that moment isn't going to happen. You're going to have this slow evolutionary process, and it's already started. But there might come a moment where the Iranians say, okay, enough has changed. We're going to come back to negotiations, but we're not going to do anything serious, and we're just buying time. At which point, then you might see the Biden administration more clearly say, well, no, like, that doesn't work for us. But, or they come back and negotiations get serious again. But we're in this murky space, and I expect that we're going to remain in this murky space for quite a while, sort of. And that, Senator, I think, is where you see some of that ambiguity, right? Is you see pressure being applied, but also still negotiations.
Yeah. Okay, that was great. SIMA, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, I'm not inviting you, SIMA, but I would just want to put it on the record of this panel. There are people who say really the only answer is to change the regime, and that there are protests all the time in Iran now. And this is the moment to encourage it, not to get involved personally, except to give support if the people rise up. But from the Israeli point of view, pretty clear when Prime Minister Bennett came for his meetings with the Biden administration, and I was in Israel a short time ago and heard this from people in government. The Israeli government, and I assume our Arab allies feel the same way, are asking for a plan B, which is a credible military threat by the US to what will happen to Iran if it breaks out toward nuclear weapons production. So what would be your plan B if the negotiations fail?
I think I can understand what you heard in Israel, because there is a kind of a frustration from the current situation and the fact that the Iranians are succeeding in wasting time and continuing their project as long as they don't go back to any real thing. And there is a more and more growing understanding that probably Iran doesn't want to go back to the agreement. So the question of what is the alternative, what is plan B, I think it should be a coordination of several elements. One of them should be also a credible military option, because at the end of the day, and I think you mentioned it also at the beginning, only if Iran doesn't, at the end of the day, Iran needs the nuclear capability because it believes that it will protect its survivability. So the way to make sure that Iran changes its position on that is to let them know that the bomb, if they reach to a bomb, that will be the end of it's not the way to preserve the system, it's the way to ruin the system. And unless they understand it and they believe it, because now they don't believe it, they think Israel is talking highly about a military option, but is not capable to do it. And the US is capable to do it, but doesn't have the intention to do it. So there is an understanding in Tehran now that there is no real threat. And I think this should be changed, because the only way, here I want to mention 2 points. The only way to prevent a war is by having this option a real option that Iran believes that it is real and credible. And the second thing is, I think
that requires an American statement of policy, right?
Statement, and I would say even before statement could be different steps that can be observed by the other side without mentioning them, but they can understand what is
Understood. Right.
And the second thing is that I believe that once it is credible, it is also a threat on Russia and China. Both of those countries do not want to see a war in the Middle East, especially China, but also Russia. So I think at the same time, it is pressure on those countries to put pressure on Iran. So it might play not only vis-a-vis Iran. And I think this is the combination of sanctions, of political isolation, of support to, even if it's not the physical support, to the people in Iran that wanted change, and the credible threat, the combination of these four legs might bring Iran to re-estimate its position.
Very good. We're over the time allotted, and unfortunately, unlike my days in the Senate, we do not have the right to filibuster here. But Mike, I could either end by pleading with everyone, demanding that everyone reads your article about Plan B in foreign affairs. If you want to say something in 30 seconds or a minute to highlight it, that's all yours, and that'll wind it up.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to be on the panel with everyone, and I echo a lot of what my colleagues said. All I'd say is that, you know, the backdrop of all this is the rapid expansion of Iran's nuclear program, and that may force some difficult choices on whoever occupies the Oval Office. And so, as a policymaker, what you want to be sure of is that you don't allow things to get to that point without having tried everything you can to prevent it. And so that's why we need to really sort of focus on this now to stop that decision from getting to President Biden's desk if we can.
Excellent. You're a great scholar and thinker, obviously not a senator because you did that very briefly, and and we appreciate it. Thanks to you, Michael, and SIMA and ILAN, in a very difficult and truly complicated fact situation with a lot on the line for the world, certainly the region and the United States. I think the three of you have really brought a lot of light to the discussion. So I appreciate it. And the reward for this is that maybe in 2 or 3 months, we'll ask you to come back and do it again. But for now, on behalf of UANI, thank you very, very much. That ends this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.